War is not only the science of destruction, it is also the science of healing. The tools and skills of modern combat medics are the result of thousands of years of military medicine evolving. But how important was care for the wounded in the past? When did armies first start hiring doctors? What were the chances of receiving medical help if you were an ancient Greek warrior, a medieval knight, or a soldier of Napoleon's army? Where were bandages and modern antiseptics first used? Today we are diving into the history of battlefield medicine. This is Mesopotamia, the land where agriculture, the wheel, and writing were invented. And also the conscript army. As Sumerian villages grew into large city-states, they began forming the first organized armies for defense and conquest as early as the 4th millennium BCE. These conscripted forces often numbered in the thousands, and just like any community, they were accompanied by an asu, a kind of semi-priest or semi-doctor. The earliest written mention of a military doctor comes from the mid-3rd millennium BCE. This clay tablet fragment is a letter from a Sumerian commander stationed at a remote outpost. He complains about crumbling walls and the lack of medical assistance. He begs his superiors to send him a stonemason and a doctor. In another tablet, there are complaints from soldiers. They complained about commanders who, during battle, left the doctors in the rear to avoid the enemy capturing valuable personnel. And on this still from the same period, wounded or dead soldiers are depicted after battle. They were brought to one place. For what else if not for burial of medical assistants? Both were responsibility of the Sumerian medical service. We don't have direct evidence of full-time military doctors in ancient Egypt. Even so, many surviving medical papyri describe how to treat complex combat wounds and bone fractures. Modern scholars believe that Egypt's frontier garrisons could not have functioned properly without one-side medical personnel, and that military medicine was essential for maintaining such an expensive professional army. The official position of a full-time military doctor was established at the beginning of the 1st millennium BCE in Assyria. It was an innovation that placed the medic within the military hierarchy and bound his loyalty to the army with an oath. Assyrian military medics not only provided necessary assistance on the battlefield or cared for the wounded, but also ensured hygiene in the garrison or during campaigns, preventing outbreaks of epidemics. The Assyrian military medical service declined along with the state itself at the end of the 7th century BCE. How effective was military medicine in the ancient world? Medical theories, that is, guesses about how the body works and how diseases arise, originated in prehistoric times and was directly linked to beliefs in spirits and gods. Medical practice was based on this theory, so it was often ineffective. Treatments where a priest appeased spirits by chanting spells could not be effective, especially on the battlefield. On the other hand, armies are pragmatic social institutions that quickly adapt what works and abandon what doesn't. War gave military doctors frequent opportunities to experiment with new treatment methods until they found something that worked. Over the centuries, priests realized that bleeding could be stopped by cauterization, wounds healed better when washed, and fractures would successfully mend if the limb was immobilized with a splint. Unlike modern combat medics, ancient doctors encountered the same types of injuries on the battlefield as in civilian practice. Sword cuts, fractures from maces and deep lacerations were nothing new since in civilian life people could be injured by a knife, suffer a fracture on a construction site, or receive a torn wound from a lion or crocodile attack. All the same, practical experience flowed not from civilian practice to the military, but the other way around. Pragmatic military medicine brought many benefits to civilian practice and significantly accelerated the development of medical knowledge. Primarily, the state of military medicine in a country depended on the overall organization of its army. After the fall of Assyria, such organized armies did not exist for a long time, and accordingly, neither did military medical corps. Throughout the entire classical age, the armies of Greek city-states were less organized and mostly composed of militias. The logistic system of Greek armies was poor, and there was no actual medical service integrated into the military. This didn't mean that Greek hoplites went on campaigns without doctors. They were accompanied by civilian doctors who were not subject to army discipline, and their presence was as common as that of other civilians, servants, wives, traders, or barbers. Usually there were very few medics. Xenophon wrote that Alexander the Great's 40,000-strong army had only 7 sergeants. And while Assyrian military medics were allowed to care for wounded enemies, Alexander ordered them to be finished off. Greek doctors undoubtedly brought back valuable experience from war, which was reflected in the works of Hippocrates. Hellenistic medicine developed completely separately from earlier Egyptian or Assyrian traditions, and many Greek practices were worse. Nevertheless, there were also effective innovations. Greek medics invented the bandage, drainage, the removal of pus from cavities using a tin tube, and practiced washing wounds with non-botanical agents such as wine and vinegar. The invention of the bandage was revolutionary and played a future role, but it didn't help the Greeks much, who hadn't learned how to stop severe bleeding. The bandage only temporarily stopped bleeding. If left on, it caused gangrene. If removed, the bleeding resumed and the patient died from blood loss. A similar level of medicine existed in the ancient Roman army. For a long time the army hired doctors on a case-by-case basis, but after a series of military reforms in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, things began to change. Now the legions were made up of professional soldiers who remained in service even during peacetime rather than returning home for other work. To maintain the army's combat readiness, a permanent Roman medical corps was created under Octavian Augustus. A number of specialized medical roles were integrated into the military chain of command and covered a wide range of responsibilities, from examining recruits and maintaining sanitation in camp to evacuating the wounded, providing first aid, and organizing military hospitals. Each legion had a medical unit with up to 10 doctors, as well as orderlies and assistants. The unit was subordinate to a medical officer. During battle, the orderlies stationed behind the soldiers would immediately drag the wounded away, provide first aid, load them onto carts, and then deliver them to the camp, where a sergeant would take over. The Romans were far ahead of their time. They had triage, stationary military hospitals, and even continuing education courses for military medics. In addition to improved forms of medicine and the introduction of more effective botanical and non-botanical wound washing agents, Roman doctors refined surgical instruments, began practicing wound suturing, and stopped massive bleeding with ligatures, tying arteries with thread. All the accumulated experience was compiled into large encyclopedic works by Galen, Soranus, Celsus, and Dioscorides. The latter spent most of his life on campaigns as a military doctor. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the military medical corps, along with the complex structure of the Roman army, ceased to exist. Civilian Italian doctors preserved the old medical tradition for a long time, but were hired by various armies only situationally. In the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which avoided barbarian conquests and is known to us as Byzantium, both theoretical materials and position for staff doctors were preserved. Still, standardized medical units were restored in the 6th century. Each numerus, that is a battalion of 300 to 400 soldiers, were assigned one general practitioner, one surgeon, and 10 to 20 orderlies who provided first aid in the heat of battle and immediately transported the seriously wounded to the camp. It is commonly believed that Byzantium had the first veterans' hospitals, where war invalids were treated for free throughout their lives. At a certain point in history, the Byzantine Empire had the highest level of both civilian and military medicine inherited from the Roman Empire. Almost everyone outside of it relied more on mysticism in medical practice than on an empirical or pragmatic approach. For example, the same Germanic barbarians who conquered Rome had no dedicated medics. On the battlefield, they cared for their wounds themselves, and afterward they were treated by relatives or priest healers, typically using magic, sacrifices, and primitive herbal remedies. Gradually, during the early Middle Ages, the ancient theory of Greco-Roman medicine spread across Europe along with Christianity. And starting roughly in the 8th–9th centuries, civilian medicine and medical education began to actively develop. Military medical corps, like those in ancient Rome or Byzantium, would not reappear until the 19th century. On the other hand, this does not mean that medieval armies lacked organized medical care. The Middle Ages are well documented, and through chronicles and sagas we learn about various combat wounds and battlefield medical practices. Armies were almost always accompanied by experienced surgeons who handled wounds and fractures of varying complexity well. Medical supply systems and the transportation of the wounded existed in one form or another and were situational. Military doctors actively used Roman surgical practices. They knew how to clean wounds, stitch them, drain pus using tubes, set closed and open fractures, extract arrows, perform amputations, and operate on cranial injuries. In the 11th–12th centuries, the first major scientific works on surgery began to appear, in which we see classifications of wound severity, detailed instruction for abdominal operations, and even anesthesia recipes. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was a growing interest among medics in developing all sorts of surgical and other devices. Individual master doctors created arrow extractors of various shapes and sizes, intricate tools for complex operations, and even movable prosthetics. Chronicles describe that medics always organized casualty collection points near the battlefield where first aid was provided. The role of carrier evacuating soldiers to the camp could be performed by servants of fellow soldiers. Documents listing military supplies often included not only weapons and provisions, but also medical supplies, bandages, ointments, and stretchers for transporting the wounded. It was not difficult to gather medical personnel and supplies for typical small medieval armies. But as soon as a situation required the spontaneous conscription of a large number of troops, such as over 50,000 during the First Crusade, medical aid became rare and disorganized. Most crusaders had not access to a doctor. Camps were plagued by unsanitary conditions and epidemics due to poor disease control. To help large numbers of sick and wounded, hospitals were established at monasteries in the Holy Land, and eventually a number of military orders emerged to protect such hospitals. The Order of the Hospitallers, for example, established infirmaries and pledged to care for sick pilgrims and wounded crusaders. The Order of St. Lazarus cared for those with leprosy and operated hospitals for lepers. The Lazarists recruited leprous soldiers and knights who were rejected by other military formations. Starting in the 7th–8th centuries, sources contain many accounts of self-aid on the battlefield. Soldiers were well aware of the necessity of applying bandages to wounds. They would bandage their own injuries or those of their comrades, using handkerchiefs or torn pieces of their clothing, often incorporating medicinal herbs found nearby. A particularly striking detail is a large number of stories about knights who possessed basic medical knowledge. They could assess the severity of their comrades' injuries, properly treat wounds, and even stitch them. There is a hypothesis that during their early training, knights received formal instruction in first aid. Alongside male physicians, women with medical skills also provided care to wounded soldiers. Researchers agree that the responsibility for post-battle care largely fell on women, either nuns in monastic infirmaries or medically trained women in urban hospitals. Female surgeons were not uncommon, and some provided medical assistance directly near the battlefield, often working alongside their husbands or brothers. Soldiers could also turn to blacksmiths for help, who often accompanied the army. Blacksmiths were frequently skilled in extracting arrowheads, cauterizing and cleaning wounds, and performing bloodletting. All the same, university-trained surgeons frequently criticized these alternative practitioners, pointing to examples where improperly treated and hastily stitched wounds became inflamed and developed gangrene. Medieval medicine included elements of incantations and prayers, but its theoretical foundation was largely based on the rational works of ancient Roman physicians and surgeons. In some areas, medieval practitioners surpassed their Roman counterparts, in others they lagged behind. Nonetheless, a standardized medical service did not exist, and no one would match the level of organization achieved by Roman and Byzantium for a long time. From the 16th century onward, the nature of warfare and military medicine began to change rapidly. With the advent of firearms, it became significantly more difficult to reach wounded soldiers in the heat of battle. Bullets penetrated deeply into tissues, and extracting them or treating such wounds became a serious challenge. Limb amputations, which were relatively rare in earlier periods of military medicine, became one of the primary methods to save soldiers from gangrene following severe gunshot or cannonball wounds. These changes forced rapid advancements in surgical practice, leading to the development of specialized instruments for bullet extraction or various amputation techniques. The treatment of gunshot wounds also evolved continuously. Initially, after bullet removal, hot elderberry oil was poured into the wound tract to stop bleeding and disinfect the area. Later, a more effective and less painful method was adopted, using ointments and compresses based on egg whites, animal fats, and plant oils, such as rose oil or turpentine. Frequent amputations forced military surgeons to reintroduce forgotten Roman tools, such as bandages for controlling bleeding, surgical clamps for blood vessels, a broader range of ligatures and surgical suturing techniques. The medical service in early modern European armies, much like in the Middle Ages, remained an important part of the military, but it lacked standardization. Doctors were still hired situationally and improvised evacuation methods for the wounded. Active experimentation with the treatment and aftercare of gunshot wounds often proved fatal for soldiers. Started in the 17th century, European monarchs began to favor university-educated physicians over surgeons with questionable guild-based training. France was the first country to systematically integrate certified doctors into its army. As a result, sanitary conditions in barracks and military camps improved significantly, and more wounded soldiers recovered. A structured military medical service began to emerge, and physicians became part of the army's official staff. This practice quickly spread across Europe. By the early 18th century, dozens, if not hundreds, of state-run specialized military hospitals had appeared throughout Western Europe. During the 7 Years' War, enemies began to actively establish standardized field hospitals and dressing stations behind combat columns. Military medics held ranks, and specialized units were formed to evacuate the wounded from the battlefield using stretchers. Memoirists recalled that during the Battle of Fontenoy, regimental sergeants performed operations directly on the battlefield and at emergency stations, after which the wounded were promptly transported in carts to the nearest stationary hospitals. Nonetheless, in large-scale battles across broad fronts with massed musket and artillery fire, such services could not provide immediate evacuation for the majority of wounded soldiers. Most soldiers had to make their way to the dressing station on their own or wait for hours at the site of their injury. Individual first aid kits did not exist, and most casualties died from massive blood loss. Bandages were not considered individual equipment, but strictly surgical tools usually applied only immediately before amputation. Until the 18th century, bandages resembled belts that were twisted with a stick. An assistant surgeon would keep the belt tight throughout the operation and release it once the arteries had been stitched. In 1718, French surgeon Jean-Louis Petit invented a screw compressor that could hold the tightened belt on place independently. From then on, the bandage could remain on a limb without needing extra hands. Petit named his invention the tourniquet, from the French tourner, to turn. In 1785, Scottish military physician Gilbert Blaine advocated for issuing tourniquets to every soldier, but his proposal was not adopted. As a naval surgeon, he always carried several small tourniquets which could be used on sailors awaiting surgery. Military medicine saw many positive changes in Napoleon's army. Military surgeon Joe Larrey became one of the pioneers of modern medical evacuation. He organized the so-called flying ambulance, replacing traditional straw-filled carts with specially built medical wagons. These wagons quickly transported surgeons and their assistants to the scene of the battle. The doctors, relying on the triage system that Larrey had perfected, provided the soldiers necessary first aid and loaded them into the wagon, which quickly took them to the field hospital and returned. Independently of Larrey, a system designed by Pierre Percy, the army's chief surgeon, was also functioning in the French military. He introduced mobile operating rooms, wagons with curtains and surgical tables, worst evacuation wagons which could transport up to 10 seated wounded, and units of stretcher bearers, so-called brancardiers, medics armed with spears that could be converted into stretchers when needed. In the first half of the 19th century, no army in the world had anything similar. Other European states lacked evacuation system and had very few doctors and medics. In most cases, saving a soldier's life depended entirely on the soldier himself. Despite the variety of wound treatment medications, many severe injuries to the limbs became infected and led to gangrene. The French concluded that immediate amputation reduced mortality from gangrene by 4 to 5 times. Thus, preventive amputation was adopted as standard. In some cases, surgeons attempt to amputate limbs right on the battlefield. The 19th century is characterized by an enormous number of amputations resulting from bullet and shrapnel wounds. Most of these procedures were performed without any anesthesia. The well-known analgesic of the time, opium, was rarely used. It was believed that immediate amputation caused less pain as the patient was in a state of shock than if it was delayed until after they had regained consciousness. In the mid-19th century, several countries introduced medical steamships, equipped as floating hospitals, and medical trains, rail cars outfitted for transporting the wounded. Both innovations were widely used by the Allies during the Crimean War and by both sides in the American Civil War. In 1859, philanthropist Henry Dunant was traveling through Lombardy and came upon the bloody Battle of Solferino, which involved over 300,000 troops. After the battle, which stretched over 10 miles, more than 50,000 wounded soldiers lay abandoned on the ground, many of them being randomly shot or finished off with bayonets. Dunant was horrified by this scene. He immediately began gathering local volunteers to help the maimed soldiers. 5 years later, he would become a co-founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross, an organization that would go on to recruit volunteers and medics to save the wounded in all subsequent conflicts. A year later, at Dunant's initiative, the first Geneva Convention was signed by several countries. It was meant to grant neutral status to military medics and to prevent the killing of wounded soldiers and attacks on hospitals, a crucial step forward. Nonetheless, in the future, the Geneva Conventions were often regarded, and the International Committee of the Red Cross was repeatedly accused of being naive, espionage, and political bias. The Franco-Prussian War was arguably the first major conflict in which both sides had well-organized medical corps and system of evacuation directly from the battlefield. Following Larrey's model, both French and Prussian forces assigned regimental sergeants and medics and deployed specially equipped medical wagons. It was also the first European war to implement modern aseptic principles. Instead of botanical washes, reliable antiseptic solutions were used. Field surgeons carefully washed their hands, surgical tools, and wounds with carbolic acid, which significantly reduced the risk of infection. Hygiene standards in military hospitals greatly improved. The Prussian army made efforts to lighten the workload of medical personnel and speed up the transit of wounded soldiers through medical posts. A Prussian infantryman was issued a personal compression bandage, gauze, and a medical ID card on which doctors recorded the type of wound and any procedures already performed to avoid repeating medical evaluation unnecessarily. Individual field dressing kits proved to be extremely effective, and similar self-help kits began appearing in all armies. Between the 1870s and the start of World War I, there were many innovations. With the invention of syringes and the refinement of pure morphine and cocaine, wounds and surgeries could be quickly and effectively anesthetized. Surgeon Friedrich von Esmark invented an inexpensive rubber tourniquet which could be mass-issued to soldiers and medics. Horse-drawn medical wagons were gradually replaced by motor vehicles, and in several European armies, dogs were enlisted to support medical units. Sadly though, the Great War of 1914 to 1918 turned out to be so bloody and devastating that no one could have imagined it. Despite maximum medical staffing and the latest equipment, the number of casualties and the difficult access to battlefields made it impossible to provide aid to the growing number of wounded. Many military doctors and medics were killed in the trenches or during assaults on no man's land. The shortage of specialists often forced soldiers to care for themselves and their injured comrades. This prompted Army Command to issue more and more self-aid tools to infantrymen experimented with individual first aid kits. Nevertheless, if a wounded soldier managed to successfully leave the front, the subsequent medical assistance was nearly identical to modern standards. The soldier would be transported to a field hospital and then by medical train or ship to a military hospital. There they would undergo X-rays, blood tests, be placed on an operating table under anesthesia, and be cared for in a clean ward. The risk of amputation after a bullet wound was minimal. During the interwar period and World War II, the medical practices of the First World War were improved. The number of medical personnel increased and medics accompanied even the smallest combat units. Surgical stations were moved closer to the battlefield. Thanks to a range of innovations such as blood transfusions, antibiotics, intubation techniques, and new methods of thoracic surgery, the number of deaths, severe injuries, and amputation was reduced to an unprecedented level. In addition to antiseptics, tourniquets, and bandages, a bottle of plasma became an indispensable tool of a combat medic. Now, even those who had lost a critical amount of blood have a chance of survival. Individual first aid kits with bandages and antiseptics became common. Tank crews and pilots whose units lacked medics had kits that also included tourniquets, morphine, anti-inflammatory and antifungal agents. The evacuation of the severely wounded became even faster thanks to aircraft transport. In the second half of the 20th century, the concept of the golden hour emerged. Statistics showed that if wounded soldiers received necessary treatment within the first hour, up to 90% could be saved. After that hour, the survival rate plummeted to 10%. The main cause of this rapid death was massive blood loss, and for decades armies experimented with effective individual hemostatic tools, many of which were either ineffective in solo use or extremely inconvenient. In 2004, during the so-called Global War on Terror, American soldiers began receiving combat tourniquets that could be tightened using a rotating windlass. This innovation allowed wounded soldiers to stop mass and bleeding on their own, even using only one hand. During the first year of using CAT-type tourniquets, combat application tourniquet, mortality from blood loss among wounded soldiers dropped by over 90%. In 2005, the CAT tourniquet was recognized as one of the greatest advancements in pre-hospital care during the global war on terror, and it was listed among the top 10 military inventions. One of the modern battlefields where we can observe the function of contemporary military medicine is Ukraine's heroic defense against Russian invaders. In addition to government-provided supplies, concerned volunteers and charitable organizations are working hard to equip Ukrainian soldiers with high-quality tourniquets and first aid kits. The modern individual soldier's medical kit is arguably one of the greatest achievements in our history. Items that now fit in a soldier's pocket, like an esophageal airway (NPA) or an occlusive chest seal, were completely unknown not only to World War I and II soldiers, but even to surgeons of those eras. The armed forces of Ukraine have developed a robust system for casualty evacuation, using armored ambulances equipped with medical apparatus, helicopters, medical train cars, and civilian emergency vehicles, among others. Yet, Ukrainian military personnel and inventors still have a wide field for experimentation. Isolated examples of evacuation stretchers, ground-based drones, medical buggies, evacuation trailers, and similar vehicles can be seen on the battlefield. This reflects the unique adaptability of the modern army to specific challenges, and it is likely that some of these improvised innovations will stand the test of time and become an inseparable part of the military medicine of the future.